Hi, I'm Isabel Shao. I'm an incoming third year at UC Berkeley studying history.
I'm Sophie DeWeese. I'm an incoming second year at UC Davis studying history and economics.
I'm Matt Chalpegian. I'm a third year at the University of Chicago studying history.
This summer, we focused on Unit 731 of the Imperial Japanese Army, which was the Research and Development Center. This Unit 731 conducted human experimentation on PLWs to help develop biological warfare weapons during World War II. I will be talking about the qualities of Japanese fascism and the context that allowed Japanese fascism to emerge. So the first aspect was ultranationalism. This began with the Meiji Restoration, shortly after Matthew Perry, who was an American naval officer, came to Japan and forcefully opened the borders and forced Japan to engage in economic trade and diplomacy with other Western nations. In addition, the Russo-Japanese War and World War I demonstrated Japan's military might as they were on the winning side of both wars. But the Treaty of Versailles showed that the West was arrogant and unfit to occupy Japan. So as a result, Japan decided that they need to instill a different kind of philosophy within their own country first. This came with total control. In 1925, they had the Peace Preservation Law, which suppressed all dangerous thought. In 1936, the February 26th incident was a coup d'etat that brought about a military dictatorship and undermined the role of the emperor. Soon after, all major parties were dissolved as a continuation of the National Mobilization Law, which nationalized major industries such as the news media and rationing. With Japan's philosophy that the West was no longer fit to occupy Asia, Japan had the idea of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. This was basically the idea that Japan should be the one occupying the rest of Asia and liberating them from Western influence. The Great Depression was a major catalyst for this. As you can see in the table, the rice and silk prices plummeted with the Great Depression. So because Japan was overpopulated at this time, they needed new resources and new land. So they looked towards Manchuria in order to get some of these resources. This resulted in the Mukden incident and led to a conflict within the League of Nations that ultimately led to Japan withdrawing. As a result, they were no longer checked by international pressures and were free to commit war crime atrocities. At the very core of Japanese fascism was their ideology. Just as Nazi Germany was united under Adolf Hitler, Imperial Japan was united under Kokutai. Kokutai directly translates to essence of the nation, and it's essentially a cult of loyalty to the emperor that dates back to the feudal era. As you see in the quote below, it says, "Every single bullet must be charged with the imperial way, and at the end of every bayonet must have the national virtue burned into it." The imperial way and national virtue refer to Kokutai, so every single action, every single atrocity, war crime that they committed was justified by Kokutai.
The main tenets of Unit 731's endeavors were to infect prisoners of war with diseases, to conduct trial treatments using untested vaccinations on controlled outbreaks of plagues in rural Chinese communities, and also field trials of germ warfare. To meet these ends, animal and human experimentation were conducted without any regard for the life of humans or animals until they were deemed lethal enough for public use. And ultimately, Unit 731 was very successful in producing bioweapons.
Among weapons of mass destruction, bioweapons are relatively cheap to produce. In the words of Sheldon Harris, author of Factories of Death, bioweapons are cheap, simple to produce, and deadly. In 1969, the cost of inciting one casualty per square kilometer was $2,000 with conventional weapons, $800 with nuclear weapons, and $1 with biological weapons. The highly destructive and inexpensive nature of bioweapons made them greatly appealing to Ishishiro, and he used cost effectiveness as an argument for the biological warfare program in Japan. Beyond issues associated with monetary disparities, bioweapons pose many problems both logistically and morally. Bioweapons date back to ancient Greece, where they made their first recorded appearance in the years surrounding the Peloponnesian War in the 400s BCE, when Sparta poisoned well water in Athens and faced a consequential blow to its reputation. Another significant instance of biowarfare took place when Mongol troops hurled plague-infested cadavers into Kaffa, a city in the Crimean Peninsula. It is rumored by historians that this biowarfare attack could have been the source of the Black Death in Europe. By the 20th century, even though bioweapons were prohibited by the Geneva Convention in 1925, the logistical and moral problems remained, and Ishichiro acknowledged that the pursuit of biowarfare violated medical ethics and could cause anguish to the unit's employees as doctors in a speech at the opening of Unit 731. Going back to the time period Isabel was talking about earlier, with the opening of Japan in the late 19th century to international trade, it also opened Japan to greater exposure to infectious diseases. Disease prevention became a priority during wartime with the Russo-Japanese War in the early 20th century. And although during World War II, these programs turned on the offense with the development of bioweapons, Unit 731 produced 20 million doses of vaccines per year. Although there were numerous rumors and intel reported by the Chinese about Japanese instances of biological warfare, they were not confirmed until 1944, and formal investigations did not begin until 1945 with the arrival of Murray Sanders. However, Murray Sanders and the subsequent investigator, Arthur T. Thompson, were unable to gain a holistic understanding of the extent of the biowarfare program in Japan. And it wasn't until 1947, with the arrival of Dr. Norbert Fell, a War Department biological warfare specialist from Camp Dietrich, as can be seen on the right, arrived, and he uncovered the full extent of biowarfare applications in Japan, including knowledge of Unit 731 and human experimentation. The later investigators in 1947, Joseph Victor and Edwin Hill, argued for taking Japanese data as they were worried that it could fall into Soviet hands. Immunity was granted almost from the beginning with the arrival of Murray Sanders, and was based on keeping information out of Soviet hands, as aforementioned, in addition to gaining truthful and complete responses and to supplement American findings related to biowarfare.
Also, in the aftermath of Unit 731's work, there were great environmental effects. The methods of distribution for their findings and their inventions heavily involved the environment and the animal populations of rural communities, including poisoning water supplies, both man-made and natural, like wells and ponds, with diseases like typhoid, releasing plague rats into local rat populations to spread disease, and also airdropping fleas from planes that were also riddled with disease. One person who has stood up in the aftermath of environmental effects is Wang Zhan. She is a Chinese national that lives in Japan that had family roots in the community of Changshan, which was struck by Unit 731's work. Decades after World War II, she happened to read a newspaper article about the survivors and the families of victims in Changshan. And she spent decades after interviewing and investigating the region, and ultimately took a lawsuit to Japanese court, which still today stands as the only admission of biowarfare on behalf of a body of the Japanese government. And even after the lawsuit, she continues to seek medical care for survivors and also educates the public with study tours of Changshan. While there's never been an outright apologies on behalf of the Japanese government for Unit 731, sweeping updates were made to the Geneva Protocols of the 1920s after World War II. And with the formation of the United Nations, there was a stronger body with which to enforce those updates. The use of biological weapons in nearly all instances was banned by these updates, but the development and possession of was not. And a lot of the language of the Geneva Conventions seem to be directed at the actions of the Imperial Japanese Army at this time. However, just a short while later in the 50s in the Korean War, the United States was found to use similar tactics to release anthrax into communities by a Soviet group of scientists. And this would stand to reason that Victor and Hill's pleading from Fort Detrick that Ishii's information was of the utmost value would have led to the deployment of similar tactics by the United States. And even though this connection seems to be somewhat similar to what the United States government did in Operation Paperclip, which was the importation of German Nazi scientists to the United States to help with the space race and other engineering endeavors, there's still a great deal of uncertainty on exactly what the role of Ishii's information was in later wars.